You guys wanted a deep dive on Truman Capote, and let me tell you, this is going to be a wild ride. We're going way beyond Breakfast at Tiffany's today. We're going to uncover the man behind the icon, the triumphs, the scandals. It's going to be good.
And what's fascinating is how much Capote's own life uh, kind of reads like a Southern Gothic novel itself. Like you can't separate the man from the work, you know what I mean?
Okay, so let's dig into this Southern Gothic childhood because talk about inspiration, right? I mean, abandoned by his parents, raised by relatives in Alabama, he even meets a young Harper Lee during this time. You can already see those themes of isolation, hidden lives, all that kind of bubbling to the surface.
Yeah, totally. And it goes beyond just setting, right? Like think about the atmosphere Capote creates, the language. There's this like sense of unease, this feeling that something's hidden beneath the surface of this like idyllic small town life. Those elements are straight from his Southern upbringing, this tradition of storytelling that blends beauty and, well, a touch of the grotesque.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And even as a teenager, he's already got this natural talent, you know? He's
Right.
publishing stories in huge magazines. At just 19, he wins an O. Henry Award. It was for his short story, Miriam. Now, this story, it's about this mysterious girl who just turns this lonely widow's life upside down. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it?
Right. It foreshadows some of his later work, especially Breakfast at Tiffany's. In Miriam, which you can find in his 1949 collection, A Tree of Light, you can see this early fascination Capote had with outsiders. You know, characters who challenge what society thinks is normal. This whole idea of the outsider, someone who just wants to connect in a world that doesn't get them. It's going to become like a major theme throughout his work.
It's like he's laying the groundwork for everything he's going to write, right?
But then in 1948, he publishes his first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms, and people were shook. Like, you got to remember, this is the American South in the 1940s.
And to have a novel with an openly gay character, I mean, that was scandalous, absolutely scandalous for the time, especially for a young Southern writer trying to make a name for himself. It was bold. And it showed right away that Capote wasn't afraid to tackle tough topics. And the story itself is pretty powerful. So there's this young boy, Joel, who's sent to live with a father he's never met after his mother dies. And, well, that alone could be a whole lot of drama.
But, oh, Capote doesn't stop there. No, sir.
Yeah.
He takes these elements of Southern Gothic, right? Crumbling mansion, family secrets, this heavy, oppressive atmosphere. And then he blends it with this really personal exploration of identity.
The father figure is especially complex. His whole relationship with Joel, well, that's really the key to understanding the whole novel.
Yeah. It's a powerful debut, that's for sure. It really made people pay attention. Then just a few years later, in 1951, he publishes The Grass Harp. This one's more charming, whimsical. It's about, well, another group of outsiders, but this time they're finding their place in a really unusual way. That image of a treehouse, right? Like this refuge from the world. It's so Capote. But even within this like whimsical setting, he's dealing with these big, serious issues: loss, belonging, how society can be so harsh sometimes. And people loved it. It was a hit.
And that success, it kind of gave him the freedom to, like, you know, experiment a little, right? He really wasn't afraid to try new things.
Oh, absolutely. He was never one to be put in a box, that's for sure. And this is where you really start to see Capote's incredible range. Like he can go from the darkness of his Southern Gothic stuff to something lighter, more whimsical like The Grass Harp. And he makes it look easy. But he's not done. Not even close. He keeps pushing, you know, keeps exploring, always searching for something new.
And that search leads him to, well, probably his most famous book, Breakfast at Tiffany's, 1958. I mean, this is the book that made him a star. Everybody knew his name.
Yeah, it's funny though. Breakfast at Tiffany's. I mean, it's iconic, right? Thanks in no small part to that movie, of course. But it's not really like the most typical Capote book, you know?
Yeah.
It's charming, sure. And Holly Golightly, she's this whole symbol of like glamour and rebellion. But Capote, he had bigger ambitions, deeper stories he wanted to tell.
And you can feel that ambition in his next project, which is In Cold Blood, published in 1965. Now, this is where things get really interesting. This isn't just a true crime story. This is Capote, like, inventing a whole new genre.
I mean, it really is. In Cold Blood is considered the first true example of like a nonfiction novel. He takes this real life tragedy, this awful murder of this family in Kansas, the Clutters, and he approaches it with the same care and detail, the same literary style that he brought to his fiction. 6 years he spent on that book. 6 years researching, interviewing, just totally immersing himself in this case.
6 years, that's dedication. But I mean, there's this tension there too, right? Because Capote wants to get at the truth of this crime, but he's also, you know, a storyteller at heart. So how do you balance that?
Exactly. And that's what makes In Cold Blood so important, but also so controversial. Capote himself called it immaculately factual. But even back then, people were asking questions, right? Like, how objective can you really be? Where's the line between reporting the facts and fictionalizing? Especially because he becomes close with one of the killers, Perry Smith. And that relationship, it inevitably shapes the story he tells.
So he creates this new genre, this mix of fact and fiction that would later be called new journalism, but it came at a cost.
And that's what we're going to get into next, because that cost. Well, let's just say it's something we're going to explore as we talk about the later years of Capote's life and the book he never finished, the one that would ultimately become his downfall.
So In Cold Blood makes him this huge literary star, but man, it's like, bittersweet, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. By the mid-60s, Capote's more than just a writer. He's like a celebrity. He's hanging out with all these rich and famous people, throwing these legendary parties. Remember that black and white ball he threw in '66? I mean, talk about glamorous.
Yeah, but even with all that glitz and glamour, you kind of get the feeling that Capote, he's never quite comfortable, Like he's always on the outside looking in.
Yeah, and that feeling, that tension, it kind of fuels his next project, the one that really does him in, Answered Prayers. Capote, he wants to write this big, sprawling novel about high society, right? Expose all their secrets, all the dirt nobody's supposed to talk about.
It's like he's using those same skills, that same sharp eye that he used in Cold Blood, only this time it's personal.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Answered Prayers so fascinating, but also kind of sad. Because Capote, he's playing a dangerous game here, and he knew it. But in '75, when Esquire magazine publishes this excerpt, this chapter called La Côte Basque, 1965, well, let's just say people were not happy.
Yeah, this wasn't just like gossip column stuff. This was Capote going for the jugular. He used these barely disguised characters based on real people, lots of them big names in New York.
He totally burned them publicly.
Yeah.
And the backlash? Brutal. Friendships over, people refusing to even talk to him. Capote, who used to be the life of the party, he's suddenly persona non grata.
Talk about a cautionary tale. All that fame, all that success, and it all comes crashing down. And the saddest part, he never even finishes Answered Prayers. It just hangs there, this unfinished masterpiece, this symbol of, like, what could have been.
He kept writing, though. Short stories, essays, even a screenplay. But those later years, there's a lot of sadness there. A lot of, addiction, declining health. And I think that unfinished book, it just makes the whole thing even more tragic,
So where does that leave us with Capote? I mean, how do you even begin to sum up a life like his? The genius, the drama, the self-destruction. It's a lot.
It really is. And I don't think there's an easy answer. Capote, he was brilliant, no doubt. Capable of such empathy, but also like real cruelty. He could be your best friend or your worst enemy. But above all else, I think he was a storyteller. He understood the power of words, the way a story can draw you in, make you question everything you thought you knew.
And people are still talking about him, right?
Yeah, that's
Still debating his work, his life, everything. It's like he's still got this hold on us, even all these years later.
And maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the mark of a truly great writer. To leave us with more questions than answers. To make us think, to make us feel. To remind us that the best stories, well, they stay with us long after we've finished reading them. So, as you dive into Capote's work, pay attention to what grabs you, what makes you uncomfortable. And maybe, just maybe, you'll come to understand the enduring power of a life lived for the story, no matter the cost.